Chapter 1. Clark Kent had been sitting at his kitchen table reflecting on his life with Lois. He had been very lucky to have found her. At the beginning things had been a little rocky, but now 10 years later, he and Lois were now happily married and the parents of 2 children. But today it was 37 years ago that he had been found by the Kents. Jonathan and Martha had been everything that a young man could have wanted in parents, and he loved them both very deeply. On this day, however, he could not help but think of his birth parents and how they had died so long ago on a planet that he had never seen. He had a globe that had let him see what his parents had looked like, and he had heard his father's voice. Somehow, he knew that he needed to be satisfied with what he had, but the yearn to meet his birth parents was always there deep within him. He had been lucky in some ways. There had been a few survivors from his home planet and he had met them. But their life had been very difficult. He continued to keep in contact with the other survivors, but for the most part he had no other way of hearing what had happened that fateful day when Krypton had exploded, killing everyone who lived on it. As Clark took a sip of coffee, he heard a knock on the door. As he turned around, he saw Clark Jr. run to the door. The family had been expecting the Kents, Martha and Jonathan, to be coming over because of the day, but the voce that Clark heard was not his parents. As he listened, he realized that his son was talking to H.G. Wells. Lois had been upstairs getting ready for work when she had heard the doorbell. She was expecting to hear the voices of Martha and Jonathan, but that was not the voice that she was hearing. As she listened, she realized that H.G. Wells was downstairs. She finished dressing and came down the stairs to greet the strange man that she had met before. Each time that Mr. Wells came to meet Lois and Clark, he appeared to be a different age. This time he appeared to be somewhere in his 40s. He smiled as he saw Lois coming down the stairs and held out her chair for her as she went to sit down. Mr. Wells liked Lois and Clark. They were true heroes and unselfish also. He had been through time, and knew what they both would accomplish through their lives. They would be nearly sainted in the future and everyone would love and respect them. Clark was watching the strange man that sat in front of him. He knew that Mr. Wells would not be there if he didn't have something important that he needed them to do, so he asked him, "How may we help you this morning?" Mr. Wells smiled at both Lois and Clark and their 2 children. The 2 children were curious about this strange man who was sitting in the kitchen. But Lois moved her arm, letting them know that they needed to leave the room. They were both disappointed, but they knew that when their mother told them to do something, she meant it. Lois smiled at the man and he began to speak. "I know that you have been with me on my journeys through time. I have learned my lesson about bringing anyone back with me from my travels. Just one experience with Tempest was enough. But, today I am here to offer you a present, Clark. As you know, I have been working on different versions of the time machine. My new machine has the ability to travel through both space and time. I now have the capability of taking you to meet your birth parents if you are interested," he told them. He was studying Clark's face to see what kind of reaction he would get from the man. He knew that Clark had always spoken about meeting his birth parents one day. Clark looked over at his wife and companion and smiled. "I have always wished to meet my birth parents, but can Lois go with me?" he asked. "Oh yes, the planet is fine for her. She will be much lighter in weight than she is here, and the oxygen level is almost twice as high as it is here on Earth, but I found Krypton very safe and comfortable," Mr. Wells told them. "So you have been to Krypton?" Lois asked. "Yes, I was there just a few minutes before I came to find you. I saw you as a baby in your mother Lara's arms. She was very worried about the long trip that you were going to make. I told her that you would survive and thrive with your new world. She wants to meet you, and so doesn't your father. It would give them immense peace," Mr. Wells told them. Lois looked at her husband and smiled. "Of course, we will be glad to go with you. I just want to make sure that we can leave the planet before it is destroyed," she told him. Clark was nervous about that. The planet did get destroyed just moments after he left the atmosphere. They would have to be very careful to leave even before he did to ensure Lois's safety. "Will you go with us?" he asked. "No, the time machine works better with just 2 occupants. I will show you how to use the machine and then you can be on your way," Mr. Wells told them with a smile. As the 3 of them walked out into their backyard, Lois and Clark spotted the time machine. This machine had been modified somewhat, but it still looked very much like the one that they had used when Tempest had attempted to kill Clark when he first arrived on Earth. As H.G. Wells explained the workings, Clark and Lois listened intently. There was a lot to learn and there was no room for error. The machine was a simple enough device, though, and Lois wasn't going to miss this adventure for anything. She had always wanted to meet her husband's real parents and this was her chance. Finally all of the preparations were finished and they were ready for their trip to Krypton. Lois went inside and got some pictures. She got pictures of the children, their home, and Martha and Jonathan Kent. She found a picture of the farm where Clark had grown up and put everything in her bag. If Lara and Jor-El were going to feel comfortable sending their son to Earth, the pictures would make them feel better. As the husband and wife sat down in the machine, Clark set the date, time and location. With a loud noise and some big yellow spots, Lois and Clark were on their way to a new adventure. But, this time they were taking Clark back to his place of birth. They were headed to Krypton to meet his birth parents and they were both very nervous. Chapter 2. Although the time between Earth and Krypton was short, the time and space expanse that the husband and wife went across was massive. As the ship landed and the young couple looked around, they realized that they had arrived at their location. The sky was very different from the sky of Earth. There were two very large moons and the sky was a very strange color. It was almost orange and the clouds were in strange shapes and colors. The colors were a blue and green. How strange they looked. They realized that the coordinates that H.G. Wells had given them brought them directly to a lab. As they looked over their head they saw the word L. Lois and Clark had just stepped out of the machine when a man entered the room. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair. He reminded Lois of her Clark. He was wearing a shirt with the letter S on it. The emblem was the same emblem that Clark wore on his Superman uniform. The man looked up and saw the two strangers standing there next to the machine where that strange man had just been a few minutes before. This couple was young and he thought of how the young man reminded him of his younger brother. Krypton had long ago learned the languages of other planets and Jor-El had a translator with him. As he spoke, the translator translated into English what he was saying so that Lois could understand. Clark had learned the language when he had gone to live with the other survivors a few years ago. He spoke up and in the language of the planet that he had come from he reached out his hand to shake his father's hand. "How do you do? My name is Clark Kent and this is my wife Lois." Jor-El was pleased to hear the young man speaking in his own language and gladly shook his hand. He was surprised to see the man do the Earth greeting. He was unaware that anyone on the planet Earth knew his language. As he was getting ready to speak to this young man and his wife Lara, his wife came into the room. Lois and Clark looked up to see a beautiful woman come into the room. She was holding a baby. They knew that the baby was him and that this was Clark's birth mother. Clark had dreamed so many times of what he would say to his birth parents if he had the chance, but for the moment he found himself speechless. Just then there was a large rumbling. Clark could tell that it was the planet getting ready to be destroyed. He looked at Lois. He knew that they didn't have much time. He spoke up and said, "My purpose here is to meet you. I am from the planet Earth, because you sent me here. On Krypton I was called Kalel. Lara looked over at the young man and gasped a little. This young man did remind her of her husband. Could it be true? Could this be her son as an adult? Jor-El looked at the young man and said, "How do you know that you are my son? I found a globe a few years ago. This globe spoke to me and told me of my past. The man in the globe was you. It is your voice that I heard." Lara knew that her husband had put a globe in the spaceship. "My son had a birthmark on the back of his neck. Can I look at your neck please?" Clark knew about the mark on his neck. His mother had told him that the mark had been there since he was born. It was a strange mark. It looked like a lightning bolt going through a cloud. As Lara looked at Clark's neck, her husband looked on also. They both saw the birthmark that they knew so well. This was their son. He was healthy and happy. They were so pleased to find that he survived the long trip to Earth. That was when Jor-El spoke up. "I have many questions to ask you. Were the people good to you on Earth? You were just a baby when you arrived. Who raised you? How did you get the name Clark Kent?" "Sir, I have so many questions for you too. I was found in a pasture by a Martha and Jonathan Kent. They were the best parents that you could hope for. They loved and raised me as their own. They have never been anything but good and kind to me and to my family. I have some pictures. With that he opened up the photo album and he showed his birth parents what his life was like on Earth. One of my biggest worries was that although you look like you belong on Earth, you do not belong there. We knew that you would have almost limitless powers. Has that affected your life much? Jor-El asked. My life on Earth was difficult at first. I am the only one that is like me. But, I have found Lois and now have 2 children. We are happy together and I have found my life. I am very happy, and I am here to tell you that I appreciate what you do for me. Clark told the 2 people who he now was positive that they were his birth parents. Lois spoke up then and said, I love your son very much. He is kind, considerate, and very brave. It is because of him that the Earth is a better place to live. He has dedicated his life to helping other people. I and the rest of the Earth have him to thank for so many things that I can't count that high, she told them as she gave her husband a hug. Lara couldn't stand it any longer. She wanted to hold her son and give him a big hug. She went over to Kall and gave him a big hug. He responded with a hug himself and she melted. It was too much for her. She knew now that she was going to die soon, but her son would survive and thrive. Her life had been worth something, after all. Her son was going to be a hero. Jor-El went to his son and hugged him also. He was short on time. The rumblings inside of the planet were getting louder every day. The council had forbidden him to building any spaceships. All he had was his small ship. The ship could only carry 1 person and he knew that it was going to hold his son. His son, the young man who was now sitting in his lab. Chapter 3. The mother and father who knew they would never live to see their son become a man looked in awe at the man who was saying that he was their son. Somehow, from the moment that strange little man had come to see them, that the man had a plan. Now, he knew what the man's plan was. He was giving Lara and Jor-El a chance to meet their son. Lara and Jor-El were both pleased with what they were seeing. The young man was cultured and a very honest man. He spoke eloquently in the Krypton language. He had so many questions to ask the young man and the lady that he called his wife. Lois had been watching her husband and his birth parents as they realized that this would probably be the only time that they would have together. The rumblings of the planet frightened her. There was no exact time available that would allow her and Clark to know just when the planet was going to explode. She looked over at the small spaceship that she had seen when she had traveled back to 1965 so many years ago. The ship was not yet finished and she knew that Jor-El needed to work on the ship quickly in order to save Clark. She smiled at the group and said, I want you to know that I love your son with all of my heart and that he is my reason for being. We have 2 beautiful children, also. Clark has done so many good things on my planet. He is considered a true hero, as he is much stronger and faster than the other people from Earth are. Lois told them with pride. Both Lara and Jor-El had worried about the fact that their son would be different from the other people on Earth. Although, he would like and sound like them, he would be very strong and fast because of the atmosphere and sun of the planet. They had worried that if their son did not turn out to be raised by good people, he might do great harm to the people. To hear that he had dedicated himself to helping the people, pleased both of them. Lara had put her arms around her son's neck and kissed him gently on the forehead. She wanted to hold this man forever, but she knew that it was not possible. There was so much left to do before the ship was ready for the trip, and the rumblings were getting louder every day. She said, I am pleased to hear that you have a good life. It is my hope that you are happy and that you find it in your heart to understand why we chose not to go to Earth with you. Clark had always wondered why his parents had made the decision to stay behind on a doomed planet. He was sure that if they had the capability of sending him to Earth, they could have saved themselves. He said, I would like to know why you did not go with me to Earth. When you sent me away from this planet, you knew that I might not have survived the trip and could have been in grave danger. With that, Clark looked to his mother and father for an answer. Jor-El was the one to speak. We know that our planet is getting ready to die. I have gone to the council that rules this planet and spoke several times about the ending of our lives as we know it. But, no one wants to listen, and the last time that I spoke in front of them I was laughed at. There was the option of sending you to another planet closer by. That is where there is a small settlement of other Krypton residents. But, the world is harsh and the living there would be very difficult, even for a child with your talents. Without supplies from the planet Krypton, life there would be almost impossible. Because of a lack of money and most importantly time, it was impossible for Lara and I to build a large enough ship to carry all three of us. Also, we are adults and it would be very difficult for us to live on such a planet. You were our hope for the future and we both knew that you deserved a chance at life. That is why you went to Earth alone, he told Clark as gently and honestly as he could. Lara had been watching her adult son's face. He was listening intently to his father. When she spoke to him she smiled. I am so proud of you. Here on Krypton you are a member of the High Society. We are a member of the High Council and go by the name L. The S that is on your blanket is in honor of your father's father whose name was Cedric. It is a custom in our world to take on the name of the father's father when you marry. We love you very much and want nothing but the best for you. I cannot express how pleased I am to hear that you are alive and have survived until adulthood. With that, Lara and Jor-El held each other in their arms. Clark got up and hugged his mother and father once again. He was glad that he had gotten a chance to finally meeting his birth parents. Jonathan and Martha Kent would always be his mom and dad, but Lara and Jor-El were the ones that had given him life, and for that he would always be grateful. Lois had been watching the three hold each other when there was another fumbling. This was much louder than any of the others and some things fell from the shelf. Jor-El smiled at his son and said, it is almost time and I need to work on your ship. It is almost ready, but time is near. Clark smiled at his father and said, is there anything that I can do to help? That brought a smile to Jor-El's face. There was nothing more that he would like than to have his son help him. They could talk as they worked. Lara wanted to get her son ready for the long trip. The spaceship was very small and there was very little room for anything but her son and the family blanket. Lois followed her to the living room and they each began getting the baby ready for his trip. Lois smiled as she watched Lara and how much love she could see that the woman had for her child. I wish that there was a way for you to come with him. But I was thinking. Perhaps you could go with Clark and I back to Earth. You would be loved and honored there, she offered. That is a wonderful thing that you are offering, Lois. But, my place is here on Krypton with my husband. What will happen will happen. Sometimes it is not the way that we wish it would be, but it cannot be changed. You are a wonderful lady and I am glad that my son is happy, she told Lois. But the rumblings were getting louder and more violent. Lois was watching as a man came to the door. The council was at a special meeting and they wanted to see Jor-El. Chapter 4. There was nothing more that Lois or Clark wanted but to take Clark's parents with them to Earth. Lois was watching Lara and thinking of how much Martha Kent had wanted a child. Clark was very wanted and Jonathan and Martha Kent had been the best parents that any parent could ever want. But, was there a way for them to at least meet before they were to die? Clark was looking at the time machine and said, I want you to meet my parents from Earth. They are the nicest, kindest people that you could ever meet. Of all the people that inhabit the planet, I got the best. They were childless and had been told that they could never have any children. When they found me out in a field, I was their dream come true. Jor-El looked at the time machine himself. If I was to meet your parents, I would want to return to the exact moment that I left. I need all of the time to prepare you for your long ride. It was a temptation that Jor-El could not resist. Here was a time machine that could take him to the planet Earth and he would get to meet the parents of his son. He looked over at Lara and said, I will be back in less than 1 minute, my love. With that, Clark and his birth father entered the time machine. Jor-El looked at Clark and said, I wish to come to your home when you are just there 1 week. I want to let your parents know who you are and why you were sent to Earth. Clark set the machine to return to the year 1965 and set the date to the month of May. With that the two men went through the vast vacuum of time. Once the machine had stopped, Clark looked around. They were at his home in Smallville. He could see his house and knew that his parents would be inside along with him. Jonathan Kent had just finished his work in the field and was headed toward the house when he saw a bright light. There was a loud noise that just lasted a few moments and then all was quiet. He watched as two men got out of the machine. This was definitely not something from his Earth, and he wondered who the two men were. As Clark and Jor-El approached Jonathan, Jonathan took a deep breath. One of the men was the man who had helped save the baby just the week before. He would not forget the young man who had looked so ill, that day. He and another lady had come to his home and asked if they had found a baby. Who is that man? And who is that man with? Jonathan wondered. Martha had been in the kitchen taking care of her baby. They had named the baby Clark after her uncle. He was such a good baby. He never cried and seemed to be very strong. She laughed to herself as she thought of the town clerk and how surprised he had been when she told him that she had given birth to a son. I didn't even know I was pregnant, she had laughed. Now the baby was safe and her life was full. She was so excited to be a mother. This is something that she had dreamed of her whole life. But, how strange that this baby was in some sort of spaceship. Where had he come from? The strange men that were asking all kinds of questions of the people in town, what did they want, she worried. But, she had heard a strange noise, and as she had looked out the kitchen window she had seen a strange flash of light. Martha picked up her baby and stepped out the kitchen door. She was surprised when she saw Jonathan walking up the walkway with that nice young man who had come to their house just a week before. My God, he is the one that asked us if we had found a baby. Martha panicked with the thought that perhaps the man was there to take her son. She held her son tightly and watched the three men approach. Jonathan Kent had already made up his mind and was not going to allow anyone to take his son. Clark was everything that he had ever dreamed of. He was healthy, smart, and would someday be a good man. He would see to that. Jonathan couldn't help but worry about the two men who were now walking beside him. He knew that Clark was a very special baby. Perhaps they were going to tell him what had happened to make the baby land in the field here on Earth. As always, Martha Kent was always hospitable. She smiled as the men approached and welcomed the young man back to her home. You look much healthier than the last time I saw you. Where is your wife? She asked. Clark found it hard to see her mother so young. She and his father had not changed much over the years. They were both kind and friendly now as they would be in the future. He smiled at his mother and said she couldn't come with me this time. I want you to meet my friend Jor-El. He is here to tell you the story of your little boy. Jor-El felt as though he was stepping into a world that he didn't belong in. But there was a problem. As soon as he walked into the room, Kall recognized him. He put his arms up and Jor-El looked at Martha Kent. Martha didn't want to let the man pick up her baby. But, somehow she knew that the baby knew him. As she watched the man pick up Clark, she knew in her heart that the baby knew the man. He smiled and cooed at the man. For a second she thought that she saw a tear forming in the man's eye. He took a seat at the table and held the baby close. Jonathan came into the kitchen with the strange young man that they had met the day before, and Martha had the feeling that she had seen this before. But how could that be? I haven't ever seen this young man but once. But Jonathan and the young man seemed to get along very well. That is when it dawned on her that she had never found out what the young man's name was. Dinner was almost done, and as the men washed up, Martha set the table for 2 more people. She smiled as she made more for the company. Something about the young man that she had met the week before. He was dashing and had a very kind face. The man that was with him appeared to be a little older than they were, but maybe in his 30s. As the 4 sat down to dinner, Jonathan looked at the young man and said, I don't believe that you have ever told me your name. Clark had avoided telling his parents what his name was. This could change history. But, he had come to their home to help with some of the mysteries of his life, and he trusted the Kents with his very soul. Clark took a deep breath and said, My name is Clark Kent. Chapter 5. Jonathan and Martha Kent looked at the young man and then at the baby. There was something about the two of them that made them think that perhaps what the young man had said was true. Jonathan found his voice first and said, "Are you telling me that you are our child?" Clark had thought of all the ways that he could tell these kind people who he was. He loved them very much and had always considered them to be his mom and dad. It was good to meet his birth parents, and he now understood why they had to give him up. But, this was his home and he had no memories of the planet where he had been born. With that, Jor-El spoke up. "This young man and the baby are the same, and I know it to be true because I am the man that sent the baby to the planet Earth. It was the only thing that my wife Lara and I could do. Our planet is doomed, and if I did not send my child to you, he would have died too. A man brought Clark to me. He know that my son wanted to meet his parents. His name was Herbert Wells and he invented a machine that allowed him to travel to my home. He brought my son Kall to me. I have had the pleasure of seeing my son as a man. You see, I am the baby's father," and with that he watched the eyes of the Kents. Martha couldn't believe the pain that the man who was sitting at her table was experiencing. She could see that the baby was very happy to see him, and she had wondered who he was the moment that he had walked through the door. Now, she wanted to know if he had changed his mind about leaving the baby here or what. She found her voice and said, "That must have been the most difficult decision that you and your wife could have ever made. But, I promise you with all of our hearts that this baby is very much wanted and loved. We will teach him to be good and kind. He will never have to wonder if we love him or not." Martha had been holding back her emotions, but could find the strength to do that no more. She reached over to the young man at the table and gave him a big hug. Clark held his mother tight, and as his father came over he took his other arm and put it around him. It was strange to be in his kitchen with 3 of his parents, but it felt good. Something felt just right about it, and as they all looked at the baby in the high chair, they smiled. Jor-El now felt much better about what was going to happen in the future. He knew that his son was going to be happy and that he was going to have 2 loving parents, who would watch over and care for them. As he looked down at the food at the table, he wondered what strange kind of food he was going to be eating. There was some kind of salad in the center of the table, but he had never seen green lettuce. The tomatoes were red, and that was truly strange to him. On Krypton the lettuce was violet and all tomatoes were brown. The meat was something strange also. It came from a cow. On Krypton there was no such kind of animal. As he tasted the food he found it to be delicious. The food did agree with him, as he knew that it would agree with his son. He could see that his son had turned out to be strong and healthy young man. Jonathan was watching the father of his son, wondering what to say. But he found the words and said, "I would like to know about your planet and what happened." This was going to be the only time that Jor-El would have a chance to tell of his dying world. He had been going over in his head how to tell them and decided that the direct way was the best way for him to go. "About a year ago we started to have a change in our atmosphere. It was very hot and many people were having trouble with breathing. 2 months later there started to be many quakes and eruptions from our mountains. Many people were killed, and a lot of our land that had once been flourishing was now a wasteland. I am a meteorologist, and so I began to write down what was going on, the locations and the times. After weeks of studying I found that Krypton was getting closer and closer to our sun. By my calculations, by the time our planet comes within 1 million miles of the sun, it will explode. Our distance is 15 million miles as of this morning, but the gravity of the sun is pulling us closer and closer every day. I am afraid that we do not have much time." Jor-El told them in a worried voice. "But surely you could save many people. You have the capability of sending your son to Earth," Martha said in a sad tone. "Our planet is controlled by the elders and they feared a panic. I was forbidden to build any ships other than the one that I had already made. The ship that my son and your son went to Earth on is only a model. They forbid me to build any others. Now I believe that the time is too near and it is too late for us to do anything about it. The only survivors will be Kall and a few young explorers who live on another planet in our same solar system. But, that is only if they survive. The planet is dangerous and life will be very difficult with no supplies coming to them from Krypton." Clark thought about the survivors that he had met and how they had tried to make him their leader. He spoke up, "Sir, I can tell you that they will survive and that I will keep in contact with them. They do have a rough life, but they will survive." This was the first time that Kall could breathe easier. He now knew that his son would live until adulthood and the people on the colony would survive. Krypton may disappear, but there will be survivors. He was pleased at what he had seen and heard. There was nothing more that he wished than for him and Lara to survive and make a home here on Earth, but that was not meant to be. As he got up from the table, he heard a knock on the door. Martha looked at Jonathan, and he got up. As he went to the door, he saw two men standing there. He had heard the talk around town. The two men were from the government and they were looking into the baby, he was sure. Jonathan swallowed hard and welcomed the men into his home. Chapter 6. Both Jor-El and Clark watched as the two men entered the kitchen. Clark recognized the younger of the two men. He would meet him later on in life and they would battle each other. His name was Jason Trask. Always a gentleman, Clark shook hands with the men and so did Jor-El. It was a strange custom for Jor-El, as on Krypton when two people met they bowed and touched heads. But, he was watching his son and Earth father for how to act. Although he spoke English and looked like a man from Earth, he was not like them, though, and the strength that he had was unnatural. He had to be very careful when he touched someone or something. With the ease of waving his hand he could kill. He knew that his son must face this each and every day of his life. The older man introduced himself as Marcus Campbell. I am here because there has been a report of a strange sighting just 2 miles down the road. There has been some damage to the nearby fields and woods. Have you seen or heard anything? Jonathan looked the men right in the eye and said, I saw nothing. On the night that everyone is talking about, I had been to the local store and then gone into the barn to care for my animals. Martha smiled at the men and in her kind, caring voice she said, would you gentlemen like a piece of cake? It was made fresh this morning. Jason Trask was in no mood for small talk. He knew that someone in this small town knew something. Everyone put on the show that they were simple farmers and had no idea what had happened. But he knew better. Jonathan and Martha had a large profitable farm and he knew that Jonathan had graduated from college. Everything in the house was modern. And who were the strange men that were sitting in the kitchen? What story had they told? A woman who was told she could never have a child had given birth over the winter? He was sure that these men were here and had probably given the Kents the child. The young man looked a lot like the child. Marcus Campbell had also been observing the town of Smallville. They stuck together and no one was talking. He wanted to know who the two men were that were sitting at the Kents' home. They did not belong in this town, he was sure of it. The man Jor-El had such a strange accent. He specialized in languages and had never heard an accent such as this man's. He spoke to the older gentleman and asked for his name and address. Jor-El knew the planet Earth very well. He had studied the planet for the past several months looking for the best place to send his son. There had been another town that he had seriously considered. The town was in Massachusetts, a town named Marlborough. He answered the man quickly and with an honest look, my name is Jor-El and I am from Marlborough, Ma. Marcus Campbell looked at the man and thought to himself, I can check this out. He turned to the younger man and asked him, what is your name and address? Clark had always felt that the truth was the best answer. But, he couldn't tell these men the truth. So, he told them honestly, my name is Clark Kent and I am here visiting my relatives. I live in Metropolis. Something about the two men did not seem to be quite true. They seemed to be out of place and not comfortable with the questions. But, they had ways to find out the truth, so he let it go. As the two men left, Clark did not feel comfortable at all. He knew that they were trouble. Their job was to find aliens and prove their existence or non-existence. They meant business and he would have to make sure that any records that they had of his being seen was removed from the records. This was when Clark told Jonathan and Martha, the young man Jason Trask will meet me again. He will be shot by a police officer. She did not know that bullets will not harm me, and when Trask aimed his gun at me, she shoots him. He tries to kill me and almost succeeds. He is very dangerous. I must get any information that he has on me away from him. I must protect you and me as a baby, he told them. Jor-El knew that what his son said was true. He smiled at the Kents and said, do not worry. Clark and I will take care of this, and with that Clark and his father left the kitchen. Martha was very worried. She knew that what they were about to face could be very dangerous. She wondered how she could ever live with this worry every time her son went out. Jonathan and Martha Kent were standing just outside of the kitchen when, to their amazement, the two men jumped into the air. They continued going and flew past her house at an incredible speed. They looked at each other and smiled. They would be the best parents to this young man that they could possibly be. What things he was going to be able to do. Chapter 7. On Krypton, Jor-El had never flown. The gravity was much stronger there, and this was a totally new sensation for him. As he flew over the trees with his son, he got a real glimpse of what the planet Earth was really like. He knew that they were going to have find those two men and destroy any evidence that they had accumulated. Clark knew the area well. It had not changed much even now. The stores were a little more modern, but the people were the same. He recognized many of the landmarks as he flew over the town with his father. One of his father's best friends was a man named Bert Cochran. He owned the feed store in town, so that is where Clark headed. When Clark and Jor-El arrived at the feed store, they were met by a very surprised young Bert. He had seen the two men fly into the back of his store. At first he thought of running, but something told him that these men were good men. As he opened the door, he looked around, making sure that no one saw him, letting the strangers in. As the two men introduced themselves to Bert, he was surprised. Jonathan had never mentioned knowing a man named Clark, but that is what he had named his son. Martha having a baby had been a total surprise to Bert and his wife Sarah. They had known that Jonathan and Martha had been told that they could never have children. Yet, last week they had come into town with this baby. Now, there were two strange men standing in his store. These men could fly. Also, there were government agents all over the place looking for something. They had taken a room in the store just 2 doors down and had been asking a lot of questions. Clark knew the man very well and knew something that might assist him and his birth father take the evidence. In the cellar of the feed store there was an old tunnel. The tunnel had been used during the Indian Wars and were still passable when he was a child. The tunnel connected the feed store with the empty office that would someday be an attorney's office in his own time. He knew that he was going to have to approach the man carefully, but he thought that Neil might be willing to help him. After talking to Bert, Clark and Jor-El both used their X-ray vision to make sure that the tunnel was indeed there. It was there, and by following it to the end they found the office where the government agents were working. Neil was one of his father's best friends, and Clark thought that perhaps it should be his father who talked to Neil. "Can I use your phone?" Clark asked. Bert was sure that these men had something in mind, and as he watched the young man call his friend Jonathan, he found himself genuinely curious. Even though he prided himself in minding his own business, there was a lot going on. Clark wanted his dad to speak to his friend Bert. But Jonathan insisted on coming into town. "Son, if something goes wrong and you need me, I can't be at the farm." "Don't worry, I think this is just as important for me to be involved at this point. I am on my way over to Bert's. Just give me about 20 minutes. The last thing that Clark had wanted was to put his father in danger. But his father was right. Bert would be much more willing to help if his friend talked to him face to face instead of on the phone. Clark and his birth father watched as the agents went in and out of the storefront. There were now 6 men and they seemed to be very busy. Clark knew that of all of the people who lived in Smallville, Bert had known the truth for some time. He had never discussed what he knew with Clark or his father as far as Clark knew. But he was sure after what had happened with Trask in the future, the man knew everything. But Bert had kept it secret and had told no one. He was sure of it because of Bert's personality and the fact that no one knew his identity yet. Bert was a man that Clark knew he could trust. Clark breathed a sigh of relief when he saw his father pulling up in front of the store. He was dressed in his overalls and had the old truck. This was how he always looked when he came into town to see Neil. The people in town knew that Jonathan and Bert were good friends, and this would not draw anyone's attention. Jonathan Kent had spent many hours with his friend at the store. Sometimes they would sit on the front porch and play checkers for hours. Jonathan went inside with his friend and asked him to take a seat. "Bert, I have a favor to ask you." Bert knew that Jonathan was his best friend. They had known each other their whole lives. "Jonathan, anything you ask is yours." "What is going on?" he asked his friend. Jonathan did not want to put his friend in any more danger, but he needed his help. He looked his friend in the eye and said, "I must ask you to let these two men to use your business to gain entry to the shop where the government workers are. They need access to your basement and to the tunnel. Please don't ask me why. The information could put you in danger." Bert couldn't help but worry about what his friend was getting into, but he said, "That is fine. What would you like me to do?" "Well, my friends here need a few minutes to get to the shop and change some information. What if you and I kept an eye on the store while we played a game of checkers?" he asked. "That sounds fine to me. The office is empty once in a while." He looked at the two men and said, "We will begin to whistle the song Dixie when the coast is clear. Is that all right?" Bert asked them. "Thank you, Bert. You have no idea how much this means to us," Clark told him. It was now getting on in the afternoon and Clark and Jor-El needed to stay in the back room where they would not be seen by anyone. Jor-El on the other hand was looking forward to spending more time with his son. But, Trask had not bought the story that the Kents had told him. He knew that the couple had been at the grain store just the other day, the day that the spaceship was seen. Also, everyone talked about the baby and how the baby was a complete surprise. He was going to go and meet with the Kents once again, and this time he was going to get the truth.